Hello and welcome to the FireMon training series on FMOS certificates. In this training video, I'll be outlining the planning and execution steps you should take to ensure successful certificate implementation in an all-in-one architecture. Let's get started. If you plan on using certificates, you'll need to generate certificate signing requests, or CSRs, and submit them to a certificate authority. When planning for this, the first decision you'll need to make is whether you'll be using the built-in FMOS CA or an external CA to sign your certificate requests. Here I'll outline the pros and cons of each method. After this review, you should have enough information to decide which method aligns best with your company's security policy. If you choose to have your certificate signed by the FMOS CA, the server that holds the database role will also hold the certificate authority role and will be used to sign your certificate requests. In the case of an all-in-one, all roles are combined into one server. The benefits of using the FMOS CA include a simpler setup and automatic certificate renewal. This option works well for smaller environments, especially those without existing external certificate authorities. The downside is that you will need to distribute the FMOS root certificate to your client trust stores. This can be done manually or through automation. I will demonstrate importing the FMOS root certificate to a Windows client later on in the demo portion of this video. The next option would be to use an external certificate authority. An external certificate authority can be a public trusted CA such as DigiCert or an enterprise certificate authority that your organization has set up to sign certificates for your internal sites. The major benefit to using a public or enterprise CA is that clients will already have an established trust with the root certificate. This removes the need to distribute the root CA throughout your environment. The only downside is that certificates signed by an external CA will need to be manually renewed. Please take some time to review the pros and cons of each approach and decide which method works best for your situation. In this section, I'll discuss some common certificate guidelines and certificate placement for an all-in-one VM. All FMOS servers will have a control panel certificate. The control panel, also referred to as the Quintuple 5 interface, is dedicated to accessing the FMOS administration webpage. Only servers with the application server role will have a 443 web interface, which is dedicated to accessing the Security Manager application. An all-in-one server has all roles, including the application server role. The FMOS certificate authority resides on the server with the database role. In our case, the database role is also included in the all-in-one VM. And finally, when joining subordinate servers to an FMOS ecosystem, the server being joined must trust the root that signed the certificate of the superior server. While not common, additional data collectors may be joined to an existing all-in-one. If so, the root certificate, whether FMOS or external, must be imported to the new server's root trust store. This will be covered in future videos that focus on more distributed architectures. Now we've made it to the demo portion of the training. We're going to go over the two methods discussed earlier. The first one being the FMOS CA, and the second one is the external CA. There are some similarities in these two methods. There's a little bit of overlap. If you're using the FMOS CA, a lot of the work has already been done as far as certificate generation. Most of what you'll be doing in method 1 is just verification unless you have to add additional SAN names. In that case, we'll do a custom CSR, and I'll go over that as part of a blend with method 1 and 2. But whether I'm talking about method 1 or method 2, I'm just going to call out which these are good for. But there's enough overlap that we can more or less combine the conversation for these two. So with that, let's get started, and I'll show you some of these commands live. Okay, now we made it to the command line. We're going to take a look at some of these steps. Like I mentioned before, some of these are going to be good for both methods, whether you're doing FMOS CA or an external CA. But the first thing we'll have to do is verify the certificates. In the case of an all-in-one, it's already deployed. So if all you need to do is export the root, you're fine. So let's take a look at the first command. It'll be fmos pki show server cert. And if you press enter on that command, what you'll see is that this certificate is bound to the 443 interface, so that'll be your security manager. There's another command that's similar to it, and the only difference is instead of saying server, we'll say CPL, and that's for control panel. So this could be the same certificate, it could be different, but each of these are bound to different ports. So the control panel is bound to the Quintuple 5 interface. Now that we've verified the certificates, the next thing we'll need to do is export the FMOS root certificate. This is going to be necessary if you want to have the SSL lock when connecting with your client. Since the FMOS root won't be trusted by default, if you have the option to distribute it in your environment in an automated way, that's advisable. Otherwise, you're limited to importing the root manually to wherever you'll need to access FireMon from. So to export the root certificate, we're going to be looking at a menu that's a little different from the PKI command we saw above. So let's go ahead and clear the screen. So whenever working with certificates locally, it's typical that it'll be fmos pki, but in our case, we're going to be exporting the CA certificate, so that'll be done in the CA menu. And just like the PKI menu, you can do a -H and see the context of the commands. So what we'll need to do is export a CA certificate. So we'll do fmos CA export, and you can tab complete if you want. Put another H on here to see what your options are. So we're going to designate which type of certificate we want. So in this case, we'll say --CA root. This indicates that it will be the FMOS root certificate, and then you'll name it. So in our case, we'll just call it FMOS root.crt. And then we can do an ls to check it in the directory, and we have it there. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and do the import into Windows. So before we're able to import the root certificate into the Windows Certificate Trust Store, we'll need to get it from the all-in-one server. So as you see here, I'm connected via WinSCP. I've got the FMOS root that we generated, and it was generated in the home folder for FireMon. It's typical to do this within the home folder. It tends to be the easiest way to go. So we're going to just copy that down, and then we're going to take that file and we're going to work with it inside the certificate snap-in in Windows. But before we do that, I want to show you in the web browser the difference. So currently I'm connected to my all-in-one. The certificates are good. Well, they're there at least. They're just not trusted yet, and I'll demonstrate that by showing you the certificate here in the browser. So if you browse to the certificate, you'll see that it has part of the chain and it's missing the root. And that's what we're going to correct here shortly. So moving from here, we'll go into our Windows Certificate Store, and what you'll be concerned with is this Trusted Root Certificate Authority folder. And you may have seen this before. Most of the, well, all of the public trusted CAs are here that Microsoft distributes. We'll need to import the FMOS certificate into this location. And to do that, we'll go All Tasks, Import, and then we'll browse for that file. Good. So this is the one that we downloaded. And this will be the FMOS root certificate. So we'll hit open there, next, and we'll place it in this directory that we're in, trusted root certificate authorities. And click finish. And that was a self-sign, so that was a warning. So yeah, we have it here, FMOS Ecosystem Root CA. So now I have the trust with the browser, and I'll demonstrate that here. Let's do a refresh. In some cases, you may need to shut your browser down, reopen it, open it up in an incognito window. We'll just go ahead and open this again. My domain is aio.simple.org. And you can see here I have the lock. And if I look at the certificate path, there's the root. Same thing is true for the Quintuple 5 interface. The trust works for both. And there's the control panel. So that was a quick demo of importing into Windows. And so we'll go ahead and move on to the next step. Another thing you may need to do when working with certificates is adding a subject alternative name to your CSR or certificate signing request. So that's more or less the step we're on, but this is also similar to the method of getting your certificate signed externally. So either you can add a SAN whether you're using the FireMon route or your external route CA to sign. So let's go ahead and get started with the first part of this, which will be generating a CSR. And we'll do that with the FMOS PKI menu. And just like before, we can add the -H for the context help. In our case, we want to do gen CSR. And the syntax will be something like server.csr -K server.key. And you can name it anything you want, .csr.key. The CSR is what you'll use to give to your team to sign if you're doing it externally, or we're going to use that here shortly to be signed by the FMOS route, and I'll show you that process. But it's really just the same. It's just the difference in who's signing the certificate. So the command as it is fine if you're not going to add a SAN, but if you're going to add a SAN, you're going to do that with a -N. And in my case, I have one that is aio-san.simple.org. And by default, when a certificate is generated, it will include the host name and the short name. So in my case, it has aio.simple.org and aio automatically appended to the SAN. I'm adding this one as a third. So once you have it all together, just press enter. You have an optional passphrase. You can press enter twice unless you have a mandate to do so. So now if we do an ls, we can see in my directory, I now have the server.csr and the server.key. So at this point, if you're using the FMOS route, I'm about to show you that, but you can take this CSR file, get it signed, and you're going to be bringing back to FMOS your enterprise route and your enterprise intermediate if you have one. So if you don't have a route and a signing CA, you can just bring the route. So we'll need the intermediate because it'll be imported as a part of the process. And I'll show you that here shortly before we do the signing. So now that that's done, we're going to talk about working with the FMOS signing CA. And the CA role is with the database, and we're an all-in-one, so we have the database integrated. So we'll go ahead and clear all this out. And as we had before in our directory, we've already exported the FMOS route, and we have the CSR and the key.
When you're getting the CSR signed, the CSR goes out, gets signed typically with your team, and then you get a CRT back, and that's what we would expect. We're going to do that, but in the FMOS CA. So for that, we'll go to FMOS CA, take a look at our options, and what we want to do is sign that CSR. So we'll go ahead and sign it by saying FMOS CA sign, the name of the CSR, and then the name of the certificate. So we'll just call it server.crt. And there it's signed, and we can see we have a server.crt, and that's what we'll use as a part of the import process. Now that we got that done, we will need to export the intermediate from FMOS to re-import this certificate with the SAN. And to do that, we're also back into the FMOS CA menu, and we'll say what before we did the root, and it's export CA cert, the same as before, and we'll do a --CA. So we see from the usage, we have root, server, host, or database. The root is what we did previously. Host and database you'll never really mess with, but in this context, server represents the signing CA for FMOS. So we'll go ahead and indicate server, and then just like we did with the root before, we'll name it. In this case, I'll call it FMOS int. Clear that out, so we'll look back at our directory. We have the root, the intermediate signing CA, and the server.crt. And from this point on, there's going to be some more overlap on the commands, and I'll explain that as we go. Now we have these files in our directory, we can start the import process. And at this point, there's no real difference between FMOS root and an external CA, except for where they were signed. They're all the same. So if you can imagine this is coming from your CA or an FMOS, it doesn't matter. You're still going to need a root and an intermediate. The only difference is where you get them from. So in our case, the first step in an import is to import the root certificate. And for that, we'll be in the FMOS PKI menu. And we'll say import CA, and then designate FMOS root as the file we want to bring in. You press enter on that. You'll see this message, successfully imported one CA certificate, if it was successful. So if you see this, that's a good thing. Now that the root is in, so that's the FMOS root. It was already there, but I was just showing you that as an example because that's how you would also bring in an external CA root. So now let's bring in the certificate with the chain. Same thing, FMOS PKI menu. And if we press the context, we'll see all the list of commands, and the two commands that we're concerned with are import server cert and import CPL cert. So FMOS PKI import server cert, and then we'll specify the server.crt that was signed, and immediately after it we'll have the server.key, which the key never left. And then we'll specify the chain, or in this case, it's the intermediate certificate. So this can be an individual intermediate, or it could be the chain with the server and the intermediate. It doesn't matter. Base 64 is preferred. If it's a container, or if it is a chain, it would likely be a PIM file. But in our case, it's just one single certificate. So for this, we'll indicate the FMOS intermediate. And that's it. We press enter on this. Successfully imported server certificate, private key, and intermediate. So this is what you expect to see. So we're almost done at this point. We have to do the same thing for the control panel certificate. These are separate commands. Same certificate is fine, but it's for different ports. So the first command was for the 443 and slightly modifying it to say import CPL cert as opposed to import server cert. Everything else is the same. We'll also import it into the quintuple 5 interface. And you'll want to see this message here. That means it was successful. Reboot may be necessary if the certs aren't showing up. Sometimes it's not necessary. It just depends. You may have to do some browser cache clearing as well. So we'll go ahead and clear this out. And we'll do the same verification step that we did before on the command line, which is fmos pki show server cert. We can also say fmos pki show CPL cert. These will verify the individual certificates per interface. If you want to see the list of CAs in fmos, the command for that is fmos pki list CAs. And this is our fmos root ecosystem, which is the only one that we've imported so far. So either fmos root or external CA, doesn't matter. You're going to import them the same. And that's it for the command line verification. We'll take a moment to look into the browser and check the SAN name. So at the browser, we can still see that in the address bar, the original URL is still working fine. So we have the lock on it. The difference being in the previous steps is that we were adding a subject alternative name, and we can verify that. See, we have the full path still, and to see the subject alternative name, we'll click on that field, and we have the new SAN that was requested earlier. And as I mentioned before, it automatically includes the fully qualified host name and the short name by default. Now I can demonstrate this further. I can also go to that URL because I have a DNS record set up for it. And you can see that one works as well. So that marks the end of the demo and the tutorial on certificates. Thank you for watching.